And once again, thanks for coming. This, obviously, we are privileged to have Bassem back in class. We are also privileged to have Lori Mulvey, who is my partner, my boss, and my wife in class. And I should have my handler, so, right, Bassem? So, we're going to continue with the last class, War is Personal, and we're going to go in a slightly different direction. But I'm going to, before we get started, we have a very special guest today, who is not Bassem, believe it or not, someone who's equally or more special than Bassem, he would say more special than him, is here today. And but we're going to continue, and I want to kind of set the class up about where we're going. And so first I want you to think about this quote right here. And many of you have heard this. This is a kind of a pithy slogan that we have been using in the United States for 20 years or so. And guns don't kill, people kill, and violent people kill. And I want to imagine what it would be if we changed it to this: Christianity doesn't kill, or Christians don't kill, but Christianity, violent people kill. And what that would mean, like how it kind of shifts, right? Because I know that you probably never thought of this in this way. But with that in mind, let me give you this little piece here. So someone counted up the numbers and estimated that a little over 100 million people were killed in the 20th century at the hands of Christians. And 100 million people. So think about what that means and how many people that is. Throughout the 20th century, it's a lot of people. 100 million. 1 million is 10 Beaver stadiums. So you imagine you're at the football game on Saturday night, and imagine 10 different times the stadium gets filled up, and then multiply that times 100. At the hands of Christians. Christians, not people who claim to be Christians, but really aren't. People who are Christians. And it sits in a slightly different way. Nazi Germany, one of the most horrific Holocausts in world history, if not the single most horrific Holocaust, the actions, the period of time for which we developed the word genocide, they were all Christians. And if you know anything about what the Nazis did, you would say to yourself, wow, this is nothing. These are not Christians, because Christians would never do that. They would never do these kinds of things. But I can assure you, the vast majority of people who committed all those heinous acts were church-going, God-fearing Christians. So when we think about 100 million people, think about the implications of that. But nobody looks in the mirror. Those of you who are Christians, you don't look in the mirror and say, well, my people with my beliefs, people who are like me, people who worship my God, people who have taken Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior, have commit really horrific things, and therefore these people are really horrible, terrible people. Can you imagine? We don't look in the mirror like that. We don't see it in this way, because they're like us. If you're a Christian, they're like us. You understand, and you still could make the argument, they're not really Christians, but let's go in different directions. Islam doesn't kill. Violent people kill. Think about what you know of Muslims. Think about what you've heard about Muslims. Think about what people around you often say about Muslims and the violence of Islam and what the Quran says and what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said and declared for his people and willed them to do. And think about all of the actions undertaken by radical, violent Muslims that are not really Muslims, in the way that those Christians are not really Christians, because Christians would not do those things. Well, Muslims would not do the things that radical Muslims do. But if you give a pass to the violent radical Christians, you have to give a pass to the violent radical Muslims. And the conversation we're going to have today is really balanced on this precipice of imagining what it would be like to understand some things going on in the world today if we didn't have the biases and the lack of understanding of Muslims that we do. Nonetheless, many horrific things have happened. In 1978, Tony Blair came up, has this global extremist monitor, and estimated that 87,000 people were killed by Muslims, radical Muslims, in 2017. 87,000, that's a lot of people. Most of them were Muslims. We haven't counted up how many Christians were killed by other Christians, but this is just one of those things that's out there. The Global Extremist Monitor talking about the radical Muslims. And I'm afraid there are many Muslims out there who would be very happy to behead me, to kill me, to do all sorts of terrible things to me because of the kinds of things that I say. And at some point in time, we'll get to the place where there will be Christians who, well, and there are Christians who feel the same way about me, would like to kill me, behead me, and so on and so forth. So here, let me just take us in a slightly different direction here. Do you identify first as an American or as a Muslim or Christian? Muslims say religion first, 49%. This is in the United States. Evangelical Christians, 49% say I identify as a Muslim first. Evangelical Christians, 70% identify as a Christian first. For regular Christians, it's 46%, so it's about what Muslims are. And so, Christians and average Muslims and average Christians are pretty much the same, except the evangelicals. These are more in line with the radical Muslims. Radical Islam, radical Christianity, they share a lot of very similar traits. We're not at a period of time right now where the radical Christians have taken control and are sending people out to destroy and kill innocent civilians in many parts of the world, although I can assure you that it is happening in some parts of the world where radical Christians are doing some really, really horrible things. So here's this guy, Ted Cruz. Imagine, I'm just playing with some ideas here. It says, I'm a Christian first, an American second, a conservative third, a Republican fourth. He's a U.S. president, he's a senator. Christian first. Imagine if he was Muslim. I'm a Muslim first, an American second. A conservative third, a Republican fourth. Imagine what we would say about him as a Muslim. Imagine the biases you'd have. But we don't even notice this. Most of us don't even notice this sort of thing. Or this guy who is president of Liberty University, advisor to George W. Bush and Donald Trump. The God of Islam is not the same God of the Christian or the Judeo-Christian faith. It's a different God. And I believe Islam is very evil and very wicked religion. This is a guy who's led many prayer breakfasts for our president. And I think we're going to have to use every, and I hate to say it, hellish weapon in our inventory, including nuclear weapons, to defeat these terrorists. Let's use the weapons we have, the weapons of mass destruction if need be. Wow. Some really powerful people have some really powerful thoughts and feelings about Muslims. Let me take you in another direction. So as we're going through the class, I want you to think about how you think about Islam and how you think about Muslims and what you actually know, all within the perspective that Christians have committed infinitely more heinous crimes in this world than Muslims. What does that mean? That's not an attack on Christians. It's an opportunity to open ourselves to understand some things about the world. Here, I'm going to go in a different direction. Military expenditures by country. The United States this is 2018. The United States is close to 40% of the world's spending on military weapons. We are 4% of the world's population, close to 40% of the world's spending on military weapons. Weapons of war, weapons that destroy, weapons that kill and take human life. 40%. How much is enough? You say, well, the world's a violent place. How violent is the world? How violent is it? How do you know how violent the world is? Have you been around? Have you traveled? Have you gone to violent places? Have you gone to places where there are wars? How many of us have gone there? What are we talking about? 40%. We are a warring society. We like war. We lead the world in building weapons of war and distributing them around the world. We are the leader in making weapons of war and selling them to other countries around the world. By far and away, we sell more weapons of destruction to other countries than anybody else. And in 2019, 36% of all the weapons that are sold from one country to another country will be sold by the United States. 51% of those to the Middle East. And I hate to tell you, but many of those weapons that we sell around the world go to anti-democratic states and states that regularly commit human rights abuses. What does that say? What's it say about us? What's it say about war? What's it say about our responsibility in the United States for wars that are happening around the world? What's it say for who we are as a people in the United States? What we want to believe. I want to look in a mirror and especially say I'm a Christian and I want to say, yes, I'm a good person and I go to church and people around me go to church and nobody wants to kill and nobody around me has ever killed and they don't support building weapons and sending weapons around the world and doing this and doing that. But it happens, and it happens in our name, and it happens by other people who are in control and who are leaders and who are running the show who are of the same belief system as many of us. And what does that mean for who we are? And so we're going to talk about war today. And we're going to make it personal because it is personal. And we're going to have this conversation. And I want to make it personal in lots of ways. Not only for the people who are impacted by war, like our friend Bassem, who is now our friend, not just my friend, not just Lori's friend, but our friend. Not just his family who died, because it's personal now. Because you now know him. And you know he doesn't hate. And you know he loves. You know he's connected. He wants you to connect with him on Facebook, for crying out loud. He wants to have a relationship because that's his message. But it's also personal for many of us because we are part of a system that propagates and spreads war and violence around the world in our name. Those of us who are Americans, and we don't really even understand what's going on. And what does that mean? So,
can I ask you a question first?
Yeah.
So, is it bad to identify as your religion first?
No.
Or are you just...
No, it's not bad. Did someone on the stream ask that? Yeah. No, it's not bad at all. I don't care how people identify. It doesn't matter. You can identify as a Christian first and you can identify whatever you want to identify. I don't really care. But the point is, if I identify as a Christian first and an American second, then the person who identifies as Chinese first and American second, or Korean first and American second, or Mexican first and American second, or Muslim first is okay. It's also okay. Okay, so we have a really special guest. And this guest is special in lots and lots of ways. She wrote this story along with her co-writer, two people, called The Uncounted. And The Uncounted it was a feature story in the New York Times. It won many awards. And the classes before you, last semester and the semester before, read it as part of the readings for this class. You will not be reading it because you've met Bassem and you're going to meet her. It's won many awards, and it's just amazing reporting on the ground. And the most important piece for me, there are many important things, but one is because she brought to the world the story of my friend Bassem Raso. But not just him. He was featured in the story, but it's not just him. It's many other people. And many of us are afraid to go to places that are in conflict or in war, and Sometimes it's because we're afraid of what we're going to see, or we're afraid that we're going to be able to handle it emotionally and psychologically and physically. Will we be killed? And, Bassem, when I asked you to describe Asma to me, you said Bassem's word was, she's crazy. She's crazy. This woman is crazy. Because of where she goes and what she does to get the information that she wants to get in order to tell the stories of the people who are not counted as victims. And increasingly in modern warfare, the majority of people who die in war are not soldiers. They're civilian combatants. Civilians. They're not soldier combatants. They are civilians who are in the line of fire just by nature of where they're living. And mind you, it's happening largely in the Middle East now. But in other periods of time, it was happening in other places, and it could very well happen right here in the United States if our system breaks down. The same thing we're seeing happening around the Middle East, in Iraq, in Syria, and so on, in Yemen, will happen right here. We have a lot of guns. We have a lot of people with radical ideology. In our case, it'll be radical Christian ideology. People will take their guns, they'll follow the radicals, and they'll go out and start killing other people. And they'll kill people who don't think exactly like they think. These subtle differences in ideology, we'll go after them, we'll be killing, and we'll be killing people, one another, by the thousands and thousands. And the rest of the world will look on and say, what's wrong with those crazy Christian Americans? Just like we look at the Middle East and say, what's wrong with those people? But I can assure you, people in the Middle East have not been killing themselves forever. It's just a particular period of time. But it could very well be us next, but I don't want to keep going. So what I want to say about our guest, most of us don't have what it takes to tell the stories of people who just are not going to have their stories told. But she did and continues to do the work. And it feels, after we've heard Bassem's story, it just feels so important and valuable to hear the stories of some other people. And so, with that in mind, I welcome Asma to class. Yeah.
What a kind introduction.
Oh my gosh.
I think that is far too kind. My work is reliant on people like Bassem and Iraqis and Afghans and Syrians who open up their hearts to me. And while what you said is so kind, I really think those words are for the people who took the courage to share their stories.
I will agree with that. I will say, however, that aside, I know that Bassem said you were crazy.
Thanks, Bassem.
But you're also fearless. And he's told me many, many stories of things you've done that he's afraid. You make him afraid. And what you've done to tell the stories. And so I think it's just immensely, if you are a journalist in this world, you would be, if you are studying any kind of journalism, you would be, to have the opportunity to have a minute with this woman, this powerful woman, is profound. You are Pakistani American.
Yeah, I was born and raised in Michigan, and my parents are originally from Pakistan.
And by the way, I just mentioned the dangerous situations you've been in. Actually,
I'm not supposed to say Michigan, am I? Yeah.
No, you're not.
No,
She, the most dangerous thing she's done is come to Penn State right now because she's a Wolverine.
Yes.
So.
Worse than Hawija. No. I didn't claim that. He said it.
All right. Anyway, tell us about the Uncounted. Tell us about, what it is, what you did, what you discovered. Summarize it for all of us.
Absolutely. The Uncounted was an investigation in the New York Times Magazine. It came out in November 2017, but it was really the product of nearly 2 years of reporting. And it emerged from what I felt was, in reading the news and seeing what was happening coming out of Iraq and Syria and the war against ISIS, was that there was a fundamental problem in what was being reported. And by that I mean there was such incredible reporting on the dangers of ISIS. There was incredible reporting on the brutality of ISIS. There was incredible reporting on the harm that ISIS was bringing into the world, and the fact that there was this US-led war to confront ISIS and take back this territory. But we weren't understanding what the civilian impact of that war was on the ground. And it really crystallized for me one day when I was looking at the front page of the New York Times, and there was, an A1 article that said, in these 2 years of this air campaign that the United States-led coalition has been carrying out in Iraq and Syria to confront the so-called Islamic State, around 25,000 ISIS fighters have been killed. And I knew at the time the U.S. had admitted to maybe 8 or so civilian deaths.
How many?
8.
8?
8. And they were claiming, the government was claiming that 25,000 ISIS fighters had been killed. Now, I knew that the number of ISIS fighters, according to estimates from organizations and even our own government, that during that time period, that number, around 30,000, had stayed relatively constant. Which would have meant, if this is true, that 25,000 ISIS fighters were killed and only 8 civilians, that the entire population of ISIS had been killed in airstrikes and then replenished. And that just didn't add up. These numbers did not add up to me. And I'm looking at this air campaign, which was critical in taking back territory from ISIS. And I'm trying to understand, could these numbers be correct? How many civilians are dying? Can I try to figure that out? And so I started making trips to Iraq that lasted over nearly 2 years. And I attempted to try to go to as many areas that had been liberated from ISIS as possible and do a sample on the ground, going door to door, interviewing people, digging through rubble, getting people's accounts, understanding where airstrikes had happened, which ones had killed civilians, which ones had not, and trying to understand systematically with a number that was, scientifically sound, going to, a statistically significant number of airstrikes in Iraq, could I understand the real rate of civilian death from these airstrikes? What would that actual number be? Could I understand why they were happening? And could I understand the impact it was having on the lives of people like Bassem? So over that period, I went to the sites of 103 airstrikes in 3 territories formerly held by ISIS. I did this cluster-based sample. I worked with a sociologist named Anand Gopal, who helped me design that sample. And I went door to door in each of these 3 places. And what I found was that while our government claimed at the time that about 1 in 180 or so airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death, a rate of 0.06% of their airstrikes, I found that 1 in 5 coalition airstrikes was resulting in a civilian death. That's 31 times higher than what our government claims. That's not twice as high, 3 times as high, 4 times as high, 31 times higher in areas that are very likely to be undercounts for a number of reasons. Undercounts because of the areas I sampled. It didn't include West Mosul, which had what is likely to be the highest rate of civilian death. An undercount because I was not able to include the children of ISIS families, like people who were considered civilians, but whom I couldn't interview or verify or authenticate. Undercounts for other reasons as well, because I was so conservative in who I was counting and whether or not I could get proof that these were civilians who had died in what were airstrikes. And so our government was off by that rate, and I looked into why. And what I found was that while the government often says that the reason for these civilian deaths are that, when they do give a reason, it's that usually somebody has walked into the frame after ammunition has been released, that they happen to be close to a targeted site, what's often referred to as collateral damage. What I found was that in half of the cases of these civilian deaths, they were the result, most likely, of poor or outdated intelligence. That they had conflated a civilian with a combatant, like what happened to Bassem's family. Over that time period, I obtained the government's own records about the airstrike on Bassem's home. They thought they were hitting an ISIS headquarters. And it meticulously sort of lays out their belief in that. But who they were really hitting were 2 civilian families. In half of the cases I found, that was the reason for why those civilian casualties had happened. It was poor or outdated intelligence. As I dug further, I met victim after victim after victim. None of them had received a payment for their civilian loss. In fact, the very first payment to anyone during the entire anti-ISIS air war was to Bassem Razo. After we presented them with evidence of his case, evidence he had submitted himself and went ignored. And remember, he is different. Bassem lived in the United States for a number of years. He was able to arrange, through connections and family members and a great deal of work, he was able to arrange a meeting at the U.S. consulate in Baghdad. You've heard his story, right, to report his case. Most of the survivors I've met are families who barely get by. They don't speak English. They never lived in America. They don't even have friends and contacts in their own government, let alone the U.S. government. None of them were able to pursue that line of justice that Bassem did. And the Uncounted really takes you through the names and faces of these people. It's been the basis for work that I've continued to do. But the hope is that if you read it, it brings you closer to understanding a reality of war we no longer talk about. Right? We have now shifted the costs of war to foreign civilians. It is a wonderful thing that fewer American soldiers are dying in U.S. wars than ever. That is a wonderful thing. But the people who are paying the highest price of civilian loss in our wars today are foreigners. And when we talk about war in the public, when the U.S. public gets worked up about it, they're often talking about the presence of troops on the ground in Syria. They're not talking about actual conflict, right? They're not talking about the thousands of airstrikes in Iraq and Syria and Afghanistan that kill large foreign civilian populations. This no longer comes up as a major talking point when we talk about war. And so the Uncounted was an attempt to center the voices of victims and survivors who are on the receiving end of that, whom Americans don't talk about. It was an attempt to give some humanity to their lives and to their losses. And it was an attempt to hold our government accountable for what it claims to be doing in war.
So,
Can I ask a question?
yeah, why don't you go?
Yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
Asma, with just what you've said so far, and you know the hashtag war is personal, the theme of the day, can you, just with a little bit you said, say what that means to you, that phrase?
I mean, war is personal to so many of the people who are impacted by it, who live in the places where these wars are conducted. And we often talk about people who deploy to areas. We have fewer American troops on the ground than we have in years, right? War is personal to the families who are affected by it, who live through it, people who've had to endure the brutality of ISIS and also a campaign of airstrikes, right? War is personal to families and people whose stories we rarely ever hear from today. And part of that is understandable. It's very hard to report in these areas. It's hard to get around on the ground. It's hard to hear these stories. Part of it is based on news organizations that prioritize what kind of coverage is most important. And part of it is about what I think is so universal in this world, which is an attempt to relate mostly to what we can empathize with ourselves because we share those personal experiences.
This is where one thing I was going to say, as Lori asked her question, I used to talk in my work about what I call international racism. And this idea that, racism in the most fundamental kind of sociological sense is this belief that some people are superior or inferior on the basis of certain biological characteristics. And there's ethnocentrism, meaning that some people or some cultures or groups are inferior or superior on the basis of cultural characteristics. But there's this way of international racism that people living in other countries and other places that I'm not connected to or I don't know or I don't understand and nor do I really want to are just not equal to the people around me. And it's understandable on one hand, but on the other hand, when it is me and my people and my culture and my economy that is creating the conditions for their lives, to be destroyed in some way, then it's incumbent upon me to be thinking about the implications of that. And I think that's on all of us, right? We like to think, hey, I treat everyone equally, or I don't want to see myself in that way. But the truth is, we oftentimes just elevate the things that we know and want to see. Hey, Bassem, can you, I know that you clearly, I think Asma is probably underplaying the importance, and maybe it's not, of your story, of what she did for you. Do you have anything you would add to her, the importance of her reporting for your? Yeah.
Well, if it wasn't for Asma, nobody would have heard of my story, because I first contacted the American Embassy in February of 2016, and then emailed again in 2 months later, and then nothing. Asma first contacted me around June or July of that year, and I was in Baghdad at that time, and she said, I would like to interview you. I said, well, I'm in Baghdad. She said, well, I'll come to Baghdad. And she drove all the way from Erbil, and we met in Baghdad, and she interviewed me for the first time. And at that time, really, I was not sure what was she really doing, until I moved to Erbil, and then when the picture really cleared up, and then I knew what this human is doing for me.
Mm-hmm. So maybe the two of you could talk a little bit about, do you have a question, Lori?
Yeah, I just didn't want to leave the phrase that you said a minute ago, Asma, where you said I went door to door, and I just think it would be really valuable for us to hear, like, what was that like? What did you see? Just the kinds of things you encountered.
So I met Bassem in April or May of 2016, and I remember telling him not long after that, I'm trying to go to this place, Kayara. I had been trying to get into a town that had been recently liberated from ISIS, where coalition airstrikes had happened, because I wanted to go door to door and I wanted to do this sample. And he was like, don't go, what are you doing? And I went anyway. And when I arrived, what I was greeted with was a town where on every block there was rubble. And I just started in downtown Kayara. It's a suburban municipality. It was the site of the first oil field in Iraq. And the people who live there are getting by. And I just went door to door. And I asked at each of these places, what happened here? And sometimes I would learn after some digging that this was a detonation, that ISIS had detonated what had formerly been a wedding hall, right? Because they found it to be un-Islamic. I go to the next house and I would be told, well, this was an airstrike against an ISIS communications center and 3 fighters died. And I go to the next house and I would meet, a woman who was crying, and she had these 2 children kind of by her feet. And she told me the story of losing 2 of her own children in an airstrike. That one of the children woke up, had a hole in her brain, was dizzy. I heard a child tell me this, that they saw their sister walk around and then die in front of them. And so I did this door to door. I would collect, if there was any shrapnel left from the bomb, I would collect it in an effort to try to identify who that was dropped by or where those munitions came from, because it wasn't just the US-led coalition dropping these bombs. The Iraqi Air Force was also conducting some airstrikes, so I had to figure out who did what. I would collect, of course, the GPS coordinates. I would interview hundreds of people. I would look them up on satellite imagery. I tried to find any corroboration online, but the heart of it was really understanding in these communities themselves what had happened and verifying that then with local authorities. So I did that in Kayara. It took several months to complete Kayara. And over time, with some effort, I was able to do 2 other areas, a small town called Shora and a densely packed urban neighborhood in East Mosul called Aden.
By the way, the towns you just mentioned, Gayara and Shora, I will not go there. As an Iraqi, as a male, I will not go there. And she went there because
What would make you not want to go there?
It's dangerous. It's really dangerous.
In what way?
It was, some ISIS were still there. you don't know the people. Some will think they are innocent people, but they were not. And she was in great danger. But she went. At that time, when she went to Gayara, we were still we did not know each other very well. And if like a year later, when I really knew her, I will probably say, no way you're going to Gayara.
How were you received in those times when you went door to door?
It's something that stuns me to my core because I don't think I would ever open my door up to any roving reporter the way people did to me. I met so many generous souls, people who lived next to the site of an airstrike. It wasn't even on their own home. Who, watched 27 bodies be put in bags after an airstrike during the liberation of West Mosul, for example. This was later. But basically people who would spend hours with me recounting every memory. They'd pull out sheets of paper and start writing down names, and they had nothing to gain from it. In fact, they only had something to lose. It is hard to talk about the most traumatic moment of your life. Just ask Bassem. I needed to reconstruct the night of the airstrike on his home. And I'd made a special trip, a second trip to Iraq or a third trip to Iraq, just to get that specific story. I needed it to be very detailed because I needed to write it in a very detailed manner. And I told him this in advance, and we would have lunch. And after lunch, he would say, Asma, I'm having such a good day. Can we not talk about it today? He did this for 2 weeks. And I was getting angry messages from a colleague of mine just saying, you haven't gotten it yet? What are you doing? I was doing other things too. I was sampling Kayara, etc. But the reality is that asking people to talk about the worst night of their lives or the worst moment of their lives is traumatic. So anytime somebody shares that with you, that they take the step with informed consent, knowing what you're asking them for, to tell you about that is a great service. And so it's again why I think my role in this is nothing compared to the role of the sources and the people who opened up their hearts to me.
Why don't you stand up?
Yeah, I think I will. Asma, remember when we took this photo?
Oh, yes.
Now, these two figures standing in the garage is me and Asmat.
It's true.
And the photographer who came with us was
This is your house. But this is
Giles
Bassem's house, right?
He was an English
He was
photographer.
a New York Times Magazine
New York
photographer.
Times Magazine. And when we went, they came with a security detail, and they gave her body arms. And he said, well, and then he was taking photos, and then one bomb hit. And the guy who was with us, he was really a soldier in the British Army. Remember when he was started counting?
He was a member of the security team.
1, 2,
He was an
3, 4,
ex-military.
boom.
Yes.
He said, well, this is coming from 10 miles. I said, is this incoming or outgoing? He said, no, this is outgoing. And then 10 minutes, another explosion. He said, this is an incoming. I said, let's get out of here. This was just before they published.
Yeah, this was in May of 2017.
17, yeah.
And
This was my first time to be back in the location, me and Asmat and the photographer.
what was it like? And we talk about this in the story, but I think it's really powerful to hear you describe it yourself. What was it like to return after having left this airstrike for the first time that many months later?
You're going to get me to cry. The first time for me to go back, the first thing my eye caught was a pair of shoes my daughter was wearing a week ago. Before the bombing, it was some party for her cousin. That was the first thing I saw. And remember what I told you about the shoes. I wanted to take them, but I just could not take them. So I just left them where they were. It was such an emotional trip for me. Looking at the destruction, I said, how did I get out of there? How did I survive? I mean, the amount of destruction is indescribable.
Here.
So, the first thing I thanked God for saving me. The second thing I did was I sent dua. We read certain verse from the Quran. I send dua to all 4 of my loved ones who were killed in this bombing. And then I said, Asma, I cannot stay for too long. We have to leave. And I've only been there once after that. I've only been, and I cannot go. Every time I go past that street, I would just take a detour because I still cannot go.
Yeah. Can you, when I hear you, and I know what you're feeling, and then I think of multiplying that by not 1,000, not 10,000, not 100,000, but by millions who have these experiences in war. And I think about how the message from the two of you is so important that we understand war from a larger context. And how difficult it is for people to sit with that. And
So, Asma, you were saying earlier, I think you just said it even a little right in this room, but that the way we think about war is always boots on the ground. And you as a civilian in this experience have a really different view. Even though you said that already, that it's really so much now, it's about civilian deaths. I wish that you can some way paint for us like how you, when you hear military or when you hear combat, or where does your mind go now, given what you've seen?
Turkey is invading Syria. Mm-hmm. Right.
So I do want to say that my reporting also does, I spend a lot of time with the U.S. military and military officials. They're probably so sick of me. There is a whole aspect of that, and in the Uncounted, I spend a lot of time at this air base where these air operations are conducted from. It's a major part of my reporting. But what I mean when I say that when we talk about war today, I'm talking about the news media, I'm talking about the national conversation of the controversies of war and the costs of war. We talk about the costs of war most strongly and understandably when Americans' lives are at risk. But the costs of war today are primarily being felt by foreign populations, specifically foreign civilians. And when those losses happen, they don't become the kinds of controversies in the same way that the idea of bombing the Syrian state would, right? When there is some kind of transgression by Bashar al-Assad, and then there is talk of whether or not we conduct airstrikes, surgical airstrikes against a few tactical Syrian military targets, that becomes a national news story that blankets coverage. And no civilians are going to die in those airstrikes, and probably warnings are going to be given in advance so that Syrian officials can remove people from those bases and that no one will die. But when foreign civilians die, it's rarely ever a news story. It becomes one when there's a mass casualty incident so large that it's impossible to ignore. But when we talk about war these days and how we define it, so many people forget that we've been at war every day for years, conducting bombing campaigns in areas across the country, but we don't think of it as war like we did during the aughts, during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when U.S. troops were on the ground in the hundreds of thousands, when it was controversial. And that is when you see anti-war movements as well, right? Today, the anti-war movement in the United States is small. It's slim. And that's largely because Americans are not paying the costs of war with human lives in the way they did in times past.
The decision to bomb these two houses was based on wrong information. And then what they did was they did an aerial surveillance for about total of 1 hour in 15 minutes intervals in the month of August around noontime between 12 to 4 p.m. The temperature in Iraq in August at that time is between 120 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So when they did the aerial surveillance, they saw nobody outside of these two houses. So they assumed that these targets are ISIS targets. The second thing they made the argument was for Muhammad. My late brother, when he comes in, his son Najib will run out of the house and open the gate for him. And they call this ISIS-like behavior, as if a big and shot commander will come in a BMW. So somebody was running out of the house, opens the door for him, and he will enter. These two assumptions was what they based their decision to bomb the two houses. When we filed our following claim, our case under the FCA, we argued with them as we said, listen, if you had surveillance the house at 9 p.m., you will see us sitting outside having dinner or drinking tea or drinking juice, and then you would have seen children, women, and men sitting outside of the house. So that's how the decision to bomb the house was taken.
So it's amazing, you know, and I understand that we're limited in the amount of intel that we can collect and so on, but we are talking about human life. When I look out in this room of people, I see people who are good people, are feeling people. All of us have people who we love. All of us have good things that we do. All of us are sentient beings, very connected. And I think if people in here saw the things that the two of you have seen and had the conversations that the two of you have had, every single person in this room would say, this is unacceptable. I cannot live knowing that we are creating the conditions in which dozens, up to hundreds of innocent people are killed and wounded and so on. I have to believe that, and I do believe that, because I know human beings, and I certainly know Americans, and I know. Can you, with that in mind, can you just walk us through, you've done it a little bit, but can you walk us, I know the two of you have taken some journeys, and you've interviewed some people together, like Hawija. Tell us a few stories of things that of people who you've encountered.
Okay, remember when we went to Hay Adan? Hay Adan was an area, very poor area, at the entrance of Mosul, and there was a bombing. And remember when I told you that they will wait and there will be a second phase of bombing. Well, there was a bombing in this Hay Adan, heavily populated area. So the men and the young men, they ran out. It was a power station or something. So they ran out to rescue. And there was a second phase of bombing. How many lost their lives? You have more than...
At least 18 and 12 injured.
Remember when we met the family with the woman with open? I mean, I had to leave the house because I could not take it. I mean, Asma has seen so many of these cases. As a man, I could not take it. It was a devastating sight. So she's been through much more of these.
Bassem, when you say the woman who, what do you...
Yes, sure, yeah, you tell them.
Yeah, so this is the Jassim family in East Mosul. They were separate from the power station strike, but they were a family who, as liberation was happening, as Iraqi forces were attempting to retake Mosul, there were a barrage of airstrikes, and people would huddle up 18, 20, 50, 75 sometimes to a house and just hole up together, praying they make it out alive. Right? There's like a street street battle happening between Iraqi forces, ISIS fighters, and simultaneously these airstrikes that are being called in by partner forces.
So for days and weeks, people are in their homes.
Yeah, especially during the liberation period. So I think we're looking at, in this case, November of 2016.
Yeah.
And this family, there are more than a dozen of them just in this house, maybe 24 or so. And it's the afternoon, they've just eaten, and an airstrike hits their house. And, I met the family not long afterward. And I met people who still had injuries that had gone untreated. This was not a wealthy family. One woman showed me, she took off her scarf, and she showed me the injury to her head, and I could see her skull. And this was more than a year after the airstrike had taken place at that point. And it was one of the cases that was included in my sample, and I kept asking the government about it. And they said, we have no record of this, et cetera, et cetera. After the Uncounted came out, after a lot of prodding, they were like, actually, we know this was a civilian death case. We actually ascertained that more than a year ago. So that by the time I had met the family, who couldn't afford basic health care, they were showing me x-rays taken on iPhones. They weren't x-rays, medical care that was anything but. They had never received a payment. The government knew that this was a civilian death airstrike. And these people were struggling to get by to the point where a woman's skull was still exposed at the top of her head. That's the Jassim family. And Bassem, because he was the only person to have ever gotten a payment made, a payment offer made to him, which we can talk about in a second, his response to that. He had received these Solecia forms, and I, as a journalist, I'm not allowed, and ethically, I don't go around distributing Solecia forms. I don't tell people, I'm going to help you file a claim with the government, but Bassem could, right? And he heard, I told him about this particular family, and he came with me. And what did
I
he do?
felt, because I knew the amount of work that she was doing, and to a certain extent there are limits to what she can do, but for me I can do it. So I went along with her. We collected information. I filled the forms and I emailed them. I still have so many forms with me. I don't know what to do with them. So remember the guy I think it was not the last trip, the one before, the guy with the grade. How many death certificates he showed us?
He showed us, I think, around more than 30 members of his family had died in an airstrike.
More than 50. And remember when we asked him how you're living, he said, I'm living on pills, cigarettes, and tea.
He said something that just haunts me to this day. He said, Asma, you're from America. Your government did this to me. Tell me how I should get my revenge. What should I do? I was stunned.
What happened to this guy, let me paint very quickly a picture for you. The army, the Iraqi army, let's say this is our street, these are houses. The Iraqi army will be attacking from the rear. So everybody in this street, they were forced by ISIS to flee and go to the next street. So they were taken as human shields. At one point, in each house, there will be 40, 50, 60, 100 packed humans in that house. And then a bomb hits. This guy lost 2 wives and 13 kids. He was buried in rubble up to here, and he saw his wife burned to death in front of him for about 4 hours. So can you imagine the state of mind that this guy is and how he wants revenge?
He was one of very few survivors of what is believed to be the largest mass casualty incident in the anti-ISIS air war.
Mosul Jadida area.
It happened March 17th, 2017. And the coalition has admitted 100 deaths at least. And civilian monitoring groups estimate that as many as 200 may have been killed in this airstrike. And through Bassem and other members of the community, I'd gone to the site of this strike, but we met some of these individuals, and this was one of them. He was one of very few survivors, and he recounted in just the most haunting terms, watching, being trapped in rubble for 4 or 5 days before he was rescued and watching his loved ones die around him.
The first time I went to the cemetery where my loved ones were buried, the cemetery, it has lots and there are streets between them. In the street between two lots, all you see is graves. So I said, who are these people? They said, these are from Mosul Jadida massacre. Over 300 graves.
There were so many mass grave sites in West Mosul, places in which there were so many bodies that during the fighting time they didn't have time. Islamically, you're supposed to bury a body as soon as possible. And so they would construct these mass graves in very short notice in areas that used to be a shop or areas that had been walking ground. I saw this not just in West Mosul, I saw it in Raqqa, which I have photos of that I can pull up, but basically I went to the site of one of these mass graves in Raqqa. We're so used to hearing about the ISIS mass graves. This was something else. This was during liberation time. There was such a barrage of airstrikes that there were too many people to bury, and you had to do it quickly, that they would take over an entire stadium. And I went to one of these stadiums in Raqqa, in Syria, and I walked the length of it. And by the time I'd come around, 3 new bodies had been dug up for burial elsewhere, attempts to identify it. Most of these bodies were civilians. Just walking along the entire span of it and returning, that's how many bodies they had just found in that short period of time.
Asma, as an American, you mentioned what was said to you or asked of you by that one man. How do you walk through that? I mean, most of the people in this room are Americans, and I'm imagining most of us are trying to walk with you, which we can't. But how do you walk through this as an American? Like, where do you find yourself feeling responsible, if you will, or not, or just anything in that realm that you could share with us?
Well, I'm a journalist first. I know we're talking about identities first, but I'm a journalist first, and that means that, in these conversations, I have to reply with an answer that is something like this, which is, I can't answer that, but I want to hear your story. I want to know what you want to do. What's your message? What do you want to tell people about how this has affected you? But in terms of responsibility, I think it's my responsibility as an American to understand what the costs of war are. And as a journalist, that means that I find that out as best as I can, and I communicate it to the public as best as I can, and I have no way of shaping or informing how people will receive that. But the goal is that it resonates. And I think that, after the Uncounted, we saw this resonate. It resulted in a section of the defense spending bill that essentially created a whole new policy for civilian casualty prevention. The appointment of an official, it was supposed to create this online portal so that people could submit allegations, so that people like Bassem, who had to engineer a meeting, it was supposed to do all of these things, and not all of those things have materialized. But, when I think about my responsibility is to uncover the costs of war, and everything else beyond that is something that I live with myself. It's something that of course I feel guilt for going to these places and taking people's stories and writing about them. And that's my career, that's how I make my living, that's what I do. But the people whom I'm writing about sometimes never see a cent. People who've shared their own stories don't necessarily get that benefit. And so when I think about guilt and response, I often think about the ways in which sometimes journalists are portrayed as vultures, right, for taking other people's stories in that way. And when I think about guilt, I think about how I can leave anytime I want. I go to these places and I leave and I come back to a very comfortable life in New York. And that stays with me.
I want to open it up to some questions, comments, thoughts, and to anybody. I have Lori and I. Lori has an endless array of questions. I have plenty of them. But would anybody like to ask a question?
Ever since you broke your story, has the government responded to you negatively, or have they dropped any new legislation because of your story?
So, I had been corresponding with officials for more than a year in advance to publication and sharing all of my findings with them, getting their responses, and they were included in the story. But the only public comment that U.S. officials made about the story specifically was actually in response to a letter from a congressman. And they said that that investigation, quote, showed the tragic costs of war. In the months following, we saw a shift, as it generated in a response. I think many people really felt strongly about Bassum's story. As it generated a response, we heard a shift in the military's rhetoric in talking about this war. So what for years they had referred to as the most precise military campaign in the history of warfare, you now had generals coming out and saying, listen, anyone who tells you that they know the true death toll, the true civilian death toll, can't possibly be telling you the truth. Something akin to that. Basically, the shift went from saying we know precisely how many civilian deaths are happening, we know that we are the most precise in history, it went to, well, we're not sure and no one's really sure. It's really hard to understand. War is tragic. And then by June following, so 6 months after publication, 6 or 7 months after publication, Congress passed the defense spending bill that had the section that I mentioned. And I'd spent time with some of the people who had shaped that legislation. I'd been interviewing them during the course of the Uncounted and after, and they said that it was done in response to what was uncovered in the story. And so it's had that impact, and I've had this response, but the reality is that, I'm not going to pat myself on the back because some legislation was introduced. I want to understand what effect that's having. Is that civilian casualty official in place? Has that online portal been created? Right now there is no one in that position at this moment, and that portal does not exist. And so I've been following up on this. I've been looking at this in other war zones. I've been looking at it in Afghanistan in particular, where there are very few admissions of casualties. And I've got a much more aggressive response to my reporting there in terms of not really allowing me access to embeds or to officials in a way that's the story is not over, is what I mean to say. That this is an enduring problem, and it's an accountability issue that, is the basis for the book I'm working on right now as well.
I also, before we take another question, I also want to acknowledge, and you touched on this, but this is much more our work that Lori and I have done. And in Bassum, when you were here last time, you spoke with students in the Army ROTC program who were really, really, really happy to have had the opportunity to speak with you. And also, but I want to say the toll that it takes on soldiers in the military who, I've never met a soldier who wanted to kill civilians or harm civilians in any way. And the vast majority of people who I've met who are soldiers who enlist in the military, not just in the United States, but other countries, we've done a lot of work with NATO, so we're familiar with, are people who really want to be social workers, but with guns. And at one point I referred to them, to soldiers, as the majority, especially when you get into things like special forces. It's like people who want to be social workers with guns. They want to protect. They don't want to kill. And so the harm that this does on people who have to carry out the orders, and just how tragic that is.
Sam, the last 3 years of killing in Iraq during ISIS was not done by soldiers.
Yeah.
It was done by airplanes
and people who sent the boms, but
exactly
were from
by
the United
drones
States,
driven from Philadelphia.
Yeah.
So it was not a face-to-face fight.
Yeah, it's just it's like a.
There's no personal
game.
fighting.
Yep. But even those people, the same thing, who are suffering from. Yes, another question.
Hi, thank you both so much for coming in and sharing such difficult experiences with us, first of all. I want to ask to you, Asma, you kind of share a media perspective on how you feel that sometimes the media doesn't focus on the personal and individual consequences of war, and that how that kind of inspires your own work. How can we, as constant consumers of media, support journalists like you, support media that does focus on this, and try to share the other untold part of the story?
Thank you. That's such a great question. And I want to be very frank. I think there is such extraordinary reporting also that exists, and so many of my colleagues have been digging into civilian casualty issues. This just happened to be the first systematic study of it in Iraq during the anti-ISIS air war. But, you know, what I've seen news organizations do is prioritize when there is a response or an interest. And so, for example, after the Uncounted, which generated interest, you saw other news organizations start to assign this. And frankly, it's by taking an interest in the costs of war. It's about talking about it. It's about elevating it. It's about sharing it. There are, you know, I'm not an advocate, but there are so many organizations that do different kinds of work in these spaces that, you know, are constantly looking for people to care. These people show up at talks I do and places I go, and some of them are, you know, decades old. They stem from the anti-war movement after Vietnam, or they're veterans groups who returned from Iraq and Afghanistan with the injuries and regrets of what they'd done. But these are people who highlight these issues, who talk about them, who work in that space. I meet them often, and, you know, I think that I, as a journalist, I don't do stories based on response. I don't do them based on, you know, clicks or readers, etc. But I think it really says something when people take a genuine interest. And the fact your mere presence and interest in Bassem is an example that you're doing just that.
Hey, thanks, and thank you. Thanks for being here. Really, and thanks for your work. Thanks for our friendship with this guy. Amazing. And really, thank you. It's just profound.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I've never thanked Asma. I would like to publicly thank her for all the things she did for me, my family, and to all the people that she really worked and still is working so hard to make their story heard. Thank you, Asma.
So we have 5 minutes. If you would like to speak with Asma, do after class. And we're going to be around Pond tomorrow. We're doing the podcast tomorrow, but in the morning or later in the afternoon. But hang on. So, Bassem, you are. Wait, hang on till.
I have been honored
wait,
to be back.
Hang on. Hold on.
Let me just read this shirt.
Yeah, okay.
I believe.
Bassem bought this
on.
shirt for me.
I believe in my right for freedom and the right of my country in life, and this belief is stronger than any weapon.
Yeah. And I think it matters that you bought this shirt in Mosul.
Yeah, this is from Mosul.
So, Bassem, I want to give you the final few words here, and we good? Yeah.
This has come up on the stream a lot, and also with me and Bassem being friends, I wanted to bring up the LGBT issue. Just a 30-second answer of how, and don't politically correct this answer, don't give us the answer that you want us to hear. What is the true answer for how do people in the Middle East, specifically that you know in Iraq, about LGBT people?
Well, it's a very controversial issue. I will be lying if you will be accepted in the Middle East now. But there are LGBT people, but they have not come out. Even for you, They did not come out until recently. So we come from two different societies. For us, it is almost impossible for somebody to say, I am gay or I'm LGBT or whatever.
Yeah.
But people, how would the average person treat me, like if not an extremist or not somebody who's, an extremist, but like how would somebody else treat me if I went to Iraq?
Nobody will bother you. Nobody will bother you. But it is not widely acceptable so far.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that means you can go to Iraq.
Yeah,
right.
Next time you come and then we fly over.
Okay.
Hey, so what I want, before you say your final words, you have 2 minutes, I want to get you all to be thinking about the questions that are going to come up in groups in the coming weeks. How is this personal to all of us as we listen to what is being said? But Bassem, 2 minutes. What do you want to say?
Since my last visit to Penn State University, it was a dream of mine that this lady helped make possible. We started dialogue with the University of Mosul, Knowledge University of Erbil. It's a dream of mine to have you guys talk. Some of you, I'm sure, they've talked with Mosul, with Erbil, with Najaf. We want to open new avenues of understanding, mutual understanding. When you are in a dialogue, please ask anything that on your mind. Don't be shy, because I know our people are shy to ask you for a few things that will probably think that will upset you. So please ask anything that you think is important. I'm so happy to be back here again. I wish you all the luck, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you. Hey, again, have a safe weekend, and we're actually going down to the tap house. I'm going to have a beer, but Boston will not be.
I will not have a beer.
Federal Tap House around 7 p.m.